Think you know Cuba? Think again.
Since the revolution of 1959, Cuba has defied expectations and flouted the rules. It is a country of contradictions.
A poor country with world-leading human development indicators. A small island that mobilizes the world's largest international humanitarian assistance.
A weak and dependent economy that has survived economic crises and the United States blockade.
Frozen in time, but pioneering in medical science and climate change adaptation.
Formerly ostracized, but with millions of defenders around the world.
Despite meeting most of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, Cuba's socialist development is not upheld as an example.
We're going beyond the headlines to explore those contradictions.
On Cuba Analysis, we dissect the facts, we put things into context, and we get to the root of the issue.
We challenge assumptions and ask, who's shaping the narrative? Who benefits from the story?
Join us!
This
is Cuba Analysis. This is Cuba Analysis, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest, David Hickey, renowned surgeon and sporting legend, and of course, an Irish icon. I'm going to pass over to Helen.
Okay.
You'd like to start?
So you've had a remarkable life as a sporting legend in Irish football, and you're also among the world's most eminent transplant surgeons. Tell us about how you developed your love and commitment to these two apparently very different pursuits.
Well, they seem different, Helen, but sport in Ireland, especially Gaelic sport, is an amateur organisation, so it's not a career. So from the front, you're never going to make a living out of football or hurling. So that is unlike soccer or rugby nowadays, where boys in school are deciding on a rugby career. And that's in our these schools here. They've been groomed in these schools now for the Leinster Academy, which is an absolute affront to the concept of sport. But anyway, football was all I was interested in growing up. I wanted to play for the Dublin football team, and that was my only ambition in life. And I achieved that at 17. So life has been downhill since. Okay? Everything else has been secondary. So that's actually true. I mean, I used to go watch the Dublin team every weekend. We'd go to Mass on Sunday praying that they'd win. We'd go to Mass the following Sunday giving out to God for not letting them win. But anyway, it was the be-all and end-all. And it's been very nice and very good to me all my life. I ended up doing medicine because my mother was a nurse and she told me I had to do medicine. So I went down to UCD to sign up, and it had a nice short queue of people who wanted to do it as well, so I signed up. And the rest is history.
Okay, so we've read that your interest in Cuba developed first for your admiration for world-leading Cuban athletes. So Juantorena, the gold medal-winning Olympian, the only person to win in the 400 and 800 meters, and Teófilo Stevenson, the three-time Olympic gold medal winning in boxing. How did you go from that admiration to learning more about Cuban society and development?
They really grabbed my imagination, and they grabbed it because they were pure sportsmen, pure athletes, and they turned down multi-million-dollar offers to do the handy thing and hop to the States, badmouth Cuba, and become multi-millionaires. I mean, Stevenson, they reckon, was the only man in the world at the time who had shared a ring with Muhammad Ali. And he had that opportunity, and he said, no, I believe in my Cuban Revolution, and I'm staying here. And Alberto Juantorena, the exact same thing. I mean, I've met him, and he's such an impressive human being. Have you?
I have met him.
Oh, amazing. So that really captured my heart with Cubans. And I've been watching them in subsequent Olympics. But what really got me involved was in 1990, I was setting up a pancreas transplant program in Ireland. And one of the countries I went to actually study the techniques was France, in Lyon, in the east of France. And I met a transplant surgeon from Havana there, a man called Pedro Albalate. And he was everything you expect from a Cuban, very good-looking, very confident, a great man for the booze and for the women and for sports. He was your typical fella. And he'd been sent by his Cuban hospital, and the Harris Hospital in Havana, to learn the technique of pancreas transplantation and bring it back. Now, he would have resisted multiple opportunities to go to the States and become very wealthy too, but he didn't want to do that. So he said, listen, you must come and visit us in Cuba when you get your program in Ireland off the ground. So I promised him I would.
Did you go to Cuba then? Like, what?
We were in Little Beach, which is only 100 miles away from Havana. So I said, well, I'm hopping across now. And they went back home to Ireland, but I went to Havana. So I went down to his hospital, which was the Instituto de Nephrologia, and met the chief there, who was a fellow called Rivera, and said, I'm here to see Pedro Albalate. And he said, you're a week too late. He's dead. So I said, what happened? And the fellow was an athlete. He was 31 years of age. How can he be dead? He said, their plane crashed in Ecuador. He's on a medical mission.
And that was in 1999.
That was 1999.
So when you arrived in 1999, like during that time, that was your first time in Cuba then? How did everyday Cubans' experience of the economic crisis, and how did it feel how was it in the healthcare sector?
Well, I came from the US or from Western Europe to Havana, and I was overwhelmed. I thought it was more advanced. There was no McDonald's signs. There was no crap. People talked to you. There was no crime. There was no children on the streets from the food, beautiful scene, smiling faces in their beautiful uniform. I said, this is not the third world, this is the fourth world. This is a more advanced society than the ones we're living in. I was absolutely, I walked down the marathon, people say hello, you can chat to people. I was never once addressed or asked for anything. I couldn't believe the place. And in fact, I was flying through Paris to get to, I had to fly to Paris. And I said, it's the first time in my life I'm flying to Paris and I'm sad. Everyone's delighted in Paris. I was actually heartbroken leaving Havana. Yeah.
Because you were leaving?
Because I was leaving, yeah, I'm going to Paris. But I was absolutely captivated by the place. Love at first sight.
Yes. I'm just going to take you back to Dublin now. So in 1999, there was a celebration for the 25th anniversary of your Dublin team winning the 1974 All-Ireland Football Championship. So you used this opportunity to go out in the crowd in Croke Park, and you took off your blazer, and underneath you'd written on your shirt, "End the blockade." So can you tell us why you decided to do that?
I decided to do it because of the absolute cruelty and genocidal intent of that blockade. And it was unknown in Ireland. I mean, we voted at the UN General Assembly every year, and then we went back to doing whatever we do. Nobody knew about it. And so I decided this is an opportunity. We have an audience of 3 million in Ireland and probably 25 million throughout the American, the Anglosphere world where Irish migrants or diaspora habit. And I thought it would be a great opportunity to actually get it talked about. So I got someone to print on the End the Cuban Blockade. I didn't tell anyone because if word got out, it wouldn't happen. the GA is so ingratiated through US money. They have no independence when it comes to that. So I coordinated with Dexter McKenna, who ran Irish-Cuban Solidarity at the time, and told him, listen, you can ring the TV and the newspapers at 5 minutes to 3. They won't be able to stop it at that stage. And at 3 o'clock then, I did my thing. And it got a fair bit of publicity. It probably didn't get the publicity you actually want, which is the police beating you up and an international incident, you know. They played it quite enough, time enough, and so marched me out of the place. But it did generate something, but not enough, obviously.
And can I just add to that, like, what was the reaction of your teammates? Did they know?
No, they didn't know until after. I told Tony Hanna, who was our captain, before we went out in the field, and he now had a lot of business interests in the States. But he wouldn't support it, but he wouldn't, well, he couldn't. I didn't really care whether he liked it or not. I was doing it. So, but the majority of them who knew about it were obviously very supportive, and the fellows who didn't were going to get out there and protest and do everything. Hope they never did anything. But at least it got a bit of publicity for a while for the cause.
Can I just clarify, did you do that action before or after you went to Cuba? Because it was in the same year.
It was after. I had been to Cuba before that. Yeah, earlier in 1999 I'd been in Cuba, and I just said, I'm going to do something. This is an opportunity that I find for a very wide audience.
Sometimes people don't really understand the US blockade until they've been to Cuba and they've seen it for themselves. They've seen the scarcity. They've spoken to people like medics who say, we would like to do these procedures, but we don't have resources.
Yeah. Well, yes, I mean, that is obvious. You go into the shops, there isn't an awful lot available. You go to the football or the baseball stadium, what's available in terms of, drinks and stuff is very, very limited. But, I mean, I was there for the opening of the baseball season in 2021 or 2, after that current Olympics. And it was the opening game, and the Estadio Latinoamericano was packed. And they didn't turn the lights on until just before the game started because there's no electricity. So this was the big game of the season, and it's normally like 10 cents to enter the inn. And because this was the opening game of the season, and also there was an Olympic gold medal being awarded, because I can't remember who the person was, but I think a javelin thrower from Cuba got a silver medal in the Olympics, and the person who got the gold medal tested positive, and the medal then was transferred. So I said, well, it's 10 cents normally. I suppose it would be $100 or something for a special event like that. It's a special event, sir. It's free. I mean,
going back to the first visit that you made when you went to the hospital of the surgeon you'd met, you actually met Professor Alfonso Guerra, who was the director of the hospital. And together you set up the Irish-Cuban Medical Association. I read in an interview that within a year you'd sent €60,000 to start an education centre for kidney disease. And you said that when you went back 6 months later, you were taken aback by the progress they'd made. Can you tell us about that?
Well, it's an interesting story now. The €60,000 that I got was donated by Ben Dunn, who is a very big supermarket and gym owner here now. In fact, Dunn Stores was where the girls had their protest in 1983 against South Africa. And he said, listen, his son was a transplant patient. And he said, listen, is there any kind of charity or any kind of charitable cause you'd like to support? I'd like to do something for it. I said, well, yes, we wanted to do something for an educational center in the Institute of Nephrology in Havana. And he said, right, Dave, how much do you want? And I said, well, Ben, come on, I mean, what do you think yourself? He said, Dave, how much do you want? So I said, geez, what do I say to this guy now? So I said, Ben, $60,000? He took out the checkbook. And I just said, Jesus, I should have asked him for $6 million. Absolutely no question. He signed the check, handed it over. I delivered it to Alfonso Vera. I came back 6 months later, and they had a new building, fully equipped with new computers, and a counterfile of every invoice, of every cent spent on that center. And the building itself was done by the doctors, the nurses, and the local community. All the money was spent on equipment that they had to buy.
And then over the next 10 years, the Irish-Cuban Medical Association donated 40-foot containers of medical equipment and medication. Wonderful. Can you tell our listeners why it was necessary to make this donation, given the high quality and coverage of Cuba's public healthcare system?
The blockade has had a very significant effect on the healthcare system in Cuba. One of the two, the Helms-Burton one, I think it is, bans anything in Central Cuba that has more than 10% of an American product in it. And that is virtually everything in medical technology. They will have a lens from some piece of equipment will not be there. So, while they're very innovative and they can do an awful lot, there are some things that they just haven't got the raw material. They can't import them. So there are things like operating microscopes, cardiac monitors, ventilation machines that we have a surplus of. And you know this yourself from the UK, Helen. We have all this equipment that has an arbitrary expiry date purely for commercial reasons. Expires, a brand new machine. And these are being thrown out. And I brought over an operating microscope that was probably close to €1 million. And it was obsolete because the handles on it had to be used anti-clockwise versus clockwise, and that had a risk of contamination. Unbelievable bullshit. But, the company who made it had this built-in obsolescence, so they had to buy a new one. In Cuba, this was a godsend. So we got around the hospitals. Beaumont was very good, but the hospitals in general were very supportive. And the portering staff and the other masters, we packed the containers ourselves. The expensive part was the containers, actually, because of the extraterritorial element of the blockade. A ship that goes to Cuba with equipment can visit the US for 6 months, which doubles or triples the cost of sending a container to Havana. So if Hamburg should bring a thing to Havana, they can't visit the US with the rest of the stuff. They have to go back home or up and down the Caribbean. So that was an expensive part of it. But yes, we did that for a while. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you've touched on this already, but just to go back to the impact of the US blockade, this year is the 65th anniversary of a memorandum written by Lester Mallory. It was the 6th of April, 1960. And he recommends it's the development of the US strategy to bring about essentially regime change in Cuba. He recommends that the US government must use economic warfare against Cuba to cause, and this is his words, hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. So from your insights into Cuban public healthcare system, what has been the impact of the US blockade? You've already talked a bit about that, but also how has the Cuban government worked to mitigate the impact and protect the population from the pernicious results?
Basically, on Mallory's statement That is a war crime. That is genocide intent. And they have carried out the longest sustained genocide in the world against Cuba. And nobody has done anything about that. But getting back to your question, Cuba has the most advanced medical system in the world. And that's from the universities right down to the doctor nurse program in the hamlet on the top of a mountain in Tamway, or from it. I mean, Ban Ki-moon, when he visited Cuba there 10 years ago as Secretary General of the United States, visited Iran. I don't know if you have visited Iran, Helen. He considered it the most comprehensive and advanced medical school in the world. Iran. Now, for people who don't know that, they have graduated something like 25,000 foreign doctors and sent them back to their own countries, including the United States, because they consider the United States a third world country and they have to actually bail them out. And this is true. They have graduated a couple of hundred American students from the inner city neighborhoods of the poorer parts of the U.S. So Cuba, at the start of the revolution, it had two things. One was the literacy campaign, because Holly Marquis and educated people will always be free. Okay? So first of all, they bumped up the literacy rate from something like 25 or 30% to 98%. I mean, it's the highest now. The United States has a 75% literacy rate, and 52% of the American population today are substandard literacy. Now, these are college graduates, and they can't read or write. So Cuba has a very, very high level of basic education, and this was done at great cost, and it was sabotaged constantly by the crowd in Miami. I mean, these teachers were being murdered in schoolrooms trying to do this work. So first of all, the education and the healthcare. And the healthcare, they understood that healthcare in the West is business. I mean, I heard a lovely comment by the Minister of Health there, I read it probably, and he said, in the Western world, you develop a medicine to make money, and health is a byproduct. Mm-hmm. In Cuba, we develop a medicine to improve health, and money is the byproduct. So if they make money out of it, that's great, but it's not the raison d'etre. But in the Western world, pharmaceutical world, it's the exact opposite. They're inventing conditions, illnesses now, because they have a drug that they have to market. So they went on a spree of basic primary health care. And they have now, after their 70 years, they have a doctor and nurse for every 120 families, I think, and you know the fuller statistics on that, on the island. And then a mind-boggling statistic. Their next level up from that is what they call the polyclinics. And they have 440 of them throughout the island. Essentially, every neighborhood has a polyclinic. And these are very well staffed and equipped. So instead of the patient driving into the city for 3 or 4 hours and having to waste the whole day to sit and see a doctor for 20 minutes into, the polyclinic does that work with the doctor coming from the hospital, the university hospital, to the clinic to see the patients. It's obviously very intelligent. They have X-ray and ultrasound equipment within that. They can deliver babies within that system. So the medicine was moved into the people. Now they have their secondary and tertiary level hospitals, and I mean they do every level of medicine and surgery, right up to heart transplantation in Cuba, bone marrow transplantation. So what they ended up with was an infant mortality rate, which is the parameter of sensitivity of the effectiveness of a healthcare system. Cuba's infant mortality rate is about 4.8 per 1,000 births, which is half Washington, D.C.'s. So what, and that actually got a headline in the New York Times there about 10 years ago. And the headline, it's unbelievable. A baby born in Cuba has a better chance of surviving than a baby born in the United States. So they know they have a lousy healthcare service. But Cuba, anyway, developed this service for 11.5 million people on a budget that was the same as the budget for our hospitals where I was working. And they had better healthcare statistics in terms of infant mortality, life expectancy, maternal mortality, under 5 mortality, vaccinated. They're Western Europe standards in all of those things.
You're an honorary professor of surgery at the University of Havana, and yet you said you had nothing to teach the Cuban doctors who do heart and kidney and pancreas and liver transplants. Tell us what you think the rest of the world can learn from Cuba's public healthcare system.
I like the little quote by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in The Little Prince. It is only with the heart that you see clearly. The essential is invisible to the human eye. Humanity, compassion, empathy. You don't need anything else to be a good doctor. The rest is on the computer, is on them. But you can't get that from the computer. And Cuba has that in every facet of its life. But their doctors are a perfect example of it. They love their job, and pay is not an issue.
Cuba took a lot of children in from Chernobyl.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Cuba, as is their wont, opened their arms, and they did it for Hurricane Katrina in the United States and were turned down. They'd rather the people drown and die. They sent the people to Sierra Leone. When people were sending soldiers in to protect the diamond mines, Cuba sent doctors in during that big wave of the Ebola virus 30 years ago. The hurricane in Pakistan, the Hurricane Mitch in Honduras. Cuba have always sent people. But they took 17,000 children from Belarus and Ukraine at the time of the Chernobyl accident. They took them in, they totally donated a holiday resort area that was for students to accommodate these people, which is a village called Tarara, 10 kilometers east of Havana. And they gave these people a beautiful accommodation. They flew them in Ukrainian. They continued their education in their own language, which Cuba always does when they go to these countries. They learn the local people's language. They wear the abayas if that's where they are, and they get on with it. And they delivered therapy right up to the level of bone marrow transplantation to these people. And were they thanked for that? Ukraine voted with the US to maintain the blockade. What they did in Angola, Nelson Mandela acknowledges Cuba is a country that ended apartheid in South Africa. Angola now is part of the Western Bloc. They have forgotten it like that. 4,500 Cuban people died for the liberty of Angola and South Africa. So how Cuba keeps doing it, how they keep a smile on their face, and how they are still willing to send doctors to areas where they're needed is amazing. But it's the revolution's concept of how the world should be.
Yeah, and as far as I know, Cuba was the only country as a national country that took Chernobyl children in. Like, there were organizations that did it, but they were within, there was no actual, you might be able to clarify that, Helen, but I think they did it as a whole national country.
If we had done it, we'd have got a Nobel Prize in medicine.
We definitely would, yeah. And they, have more doctors than San Fernando Sans Frontières.
Médecins.
Sans Frontières, that's totally wrong.
They have more. They actually have more doctors than the whole of the World Health Organization working abroad. Yes, and the latest estimation is about 600,000 Cuban medical professionals have worked overseas since 1960, since their first trip abroad. But then there are different forms of medical internationalism. So on the one hand, there's those medics that have been overseas. But then on the other hand, what we were talking about is the medical programs where foreigners come to Cuba to get free treatment. And there's been the Children of Chernobyl program, which was a really big program. But the other really big program was the Operation Milagro, Operation Miracle, for the restoration of restoration of eyesight for people with easily reversible blindness.
The great story about Milagro and Bolivia, the group went to this town in Bolivia through their cataract operations, and they were presented with a fellow called Sergeant Terran. Do you know this story?
You tell us.
Sergeant Terran was the man involved in the murder of Che Guevara. And he had, unbelievably, the confidence in submitting himself to Cuban doctors to have his eyesight restored. He knew, they knew who he was, and they did their operation on him and restored his sight. Again, where else in the world did that happen? And they're propagating terrorism throughout the world.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Hurricane Katrina, right?
Yes.
So this is under the Bush administration, which had put Cuba at that point on the list of rogue states and had Cuba in their sights in a context of invasions and wars and occupations. And yet Cuba offered disinterested medical support for, essentially it was the poor and working class that were left abandoned after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and surrounding areas. And the Bush administration subsequently read out a list of countries that had made donations and just left Cuba off the list. So not only did they not receive the assistance, and Fidel Castro said a few weeks later, it was a terrible thing. It was as if we were watching a boat sinking off our coastline and people dying, and we were being denied the right to go and assist them and save those lives.
Look at Gaza now. The people who are complaining and protesting about that are the people who have been prosecuted and beaten up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same pathology. I mean, these people, I think they are so scared of Cuba, the United States. And that's the bottom line of this is. The example of country.
Well, I have a question on that, actually, because you have described capitalism in a recent interview as failing. And you pointed out that it's left 85% of the world in abject poverty. Despite the US blockade and despite its underdevelopment as a small Caribbean island subject to 400 years of colonialism and imperialism, Cuba is now categorized by the UN as reaching high human development. So what does Cuba show us about the potential for socialist development?
Well, Cuba is a poor country with zero poverty. Now that sounds paradoxical, but poverty is sleeping on the streets. Poverty is having no access to food, no access to education, no access to medicine, no access to housing. I heard someone say, the only Cuban child sleeping on the street lives in Miami. Everybody has a home in Cuba. I don't see people sleeping on the streets and I'm walking around there. And I think the leadership they had at the start were extraordinary people. I mean, they had every opportunity, every temptation to do what most of these fellows do when they get independence in any of these countries. They sign off the resources of the country to the right people and end up with a bank account in Switzerland and a villa on Lake Garda. So none of the Cuban leaders profited in any way And I mean, they're an example to the world. I mean, they really are.
So on that, the example, I mean, do you think that Cuba has faced 65 years of hostility from the United States and other imperialist countries because it represents the threat of a good example in a world that, as you say, has left 85% of the population in poverty due to capitalist development?
Yeah. I mean, capitalism needs poverty. It needs division within society. It needs people fighting among themselves over the crumbs that fall to actually maintain its profit concept. Cuba is the anathema to that. I mean, and they don't want this to succeed. And, you know, Cuba actually, in my opinion, is the freest country in the world. I mean, you saw our government recently, this Occupied Territories Bill. There was an election before Christmas, and that was a big topic with the electorate, and they were guaranteed they were going to sign that the minute they were elected. Now, this is a very important bill, and a very important bill for Europe, because it will start a snowballing effect. The new government got elected. We were pounding on the doors and everything. And a letter came from someone called Cronin, who apparently was the US ambassador, telling him to scrap it. And they even admitted that. And that's why the bill hasn't been signed. The US ambassador told them not to sign it. I mean, we're not sovereign anymore. And the UK isn't sovereign. And most of Western Europe isn't. They do what they're told now. We're doormats. We're almost top of the doormat league now in terms of what we actually take from them here.
Just as a part of that, every time we meet, you're wearing a keffiyeh. So can you tell me why that's important, and also about the links between Cuba and Palestine?
Cuba and Palestine, in my opinion, are very similar. For that, they have the same attitude to family, to music, to culture, to food, to dancing. And they are essentially a very good-looking, happy race of people. They were the only country that accepted the Jews that were banned from every country in Europe and in the Western United States. They took them in and gave them a home. And then they were turned on by the savage Zionist Israeli concept. So, I mean, if you have any heart in you at all, any sense of justice, you should be outraged by that. So, Cuba has been fighting for 60 years. Egypt has been fighting for 70 years. Cuba's been fighting for 400 years, but, you know, they have a very common theme. And we are the same. We were the sort of the blacks of Europe. We were, when the Irish people first went to the United States, they were on the lowest level of the low. I mean, there's a book by a guy called Ignatieff called How the Irish Became White. And I mean, it's not a nice history either, because you became white by beating the fellow on the level below you. So there's a nasty element to that diaspora. But generally speaking, I like the San Patricios. Do you know that story? The San Patricios were a group of young boys who left Ireland in 1845 at the height of the famine and went to the US. And the way of feeding yourself in those days is you joined the US Army. So they were signed up into the US Army and then sent to invade Mexico in 1848, when America stole all those states off Mexico. So they marched down with Captain Riley. And when they got into Mexico, and these were poor, illiterate, young Irish men, when they saw the injustice of the United States, in spite of not a hope in hell of actually achieving much, they changed sides and fought with the Mexicans in a town called Surabusco. They were all killed. And the ones that survived were branded on their faces and then hung. And there is a piazza in Mexico City named after them, Piazza San Patricios. That's the spirit of Ireland.
Just to go back to Palestine as well, and about the medical side, because there are many Palestinians who study in Cuba, I believe, and then they would go back to Palestine.
Yes. We have had a large percentage of the medical students in Ireland, the overseas medics, used to come from Palestine. And they have had a very hard time. I don't know if you remember the Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain in 2011. Doctors protested about whatever, the brutality of that regime, and they were beaten up, they were murdered. A lot of them were students of our medical school. Not a word from our medical school. 1,100 doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers have been murdered in Gaza. Nothing from the Irish medical establishment. Nothing. Cuba has 250 medical students training in Cuba at the moment, and they've offered 250 more places for students in the future when they can get out of Palestine.
No, so this is for Palestinian students.
Palestinian students
Cuba.
To get a full medical education, to go back to Palestine and reconstitute. Now, can you imagine how the Americans feel about that? But that is, 250 medical student patients is probably $1 billion. In terms, if you were giving 250 full medical degrees in a Western world, it would be at least $2 million per patient, per person. So Cuba will help Palestine. It will be made difficult for them. It will be called terrorism, actually. Producing Cuban doctors will be called terrorism because that's what they're doing now. They're trying to badmouth Cuban doctors overseas in some places. And see, the problem with the Cuban doctors who go to Venezuela, for instance, someone who gets a medical education in Venezuela ends up doing the breast implants from from this world. The people who look after the poor are the Cuban doctors. And this gets very bad press for the Venezuelans. So the Venezuelan Medical Association does not support and tries to undermine by saying that, they're not real doctors, which is absolutely garbage, of course.
Just on a slightly different, but your connection with Cuba is also personal. You married a Cuban neurosurgeon, Yamile, do I say that right? Who is clearly a remarkable woman. Do you mind telling us what you learned from her? Well, as well as lots of other things, but yeah.
Yes, Yami was an extraordinary person. Obviously, I wouldn't marry her unless she was. But she was a product of the Lenin School, Helen, you probably know it. And she was the student leader. She was the head student in the school in her final 2 years in that place. And she was twice took a group of students to Russia. She was the leader of that. At a time when they didn't really go anywhere, students didn't. But just the whole spirit, the whole kind of warmth, the whole disrespect for authority, which I love about the Cubans. She had all of that. She also saved my life twice, which is interesting as well. I had very significant surgery there 7 years ago, and it didn't go well. Which usually happens when a big name that's an operation done by another big name. They kind of there's so many, nervous interventions that it always goes wrong. But anyway, I had 2 bad hemorrhages after the operation, and the only one in the room with me was Yami, and she managed to stop the bleeding both times, and organize for and then not to start trying to do stuff, and he needs to go to the operating room. And I think, Helen, when they say you need to do something in Cuba, if you don't do it, they let you know very quickly what's right. You start pushing the plan. But twice. Unfortunately, I wasn't there to save her own life. She died in Tarara, believe it or not, that beach where the Chernobyl children. And she was a almost Olympic standard swimmer. She died, she drowned in Tarara. Yeah. But she's with us always there. And we have this 23-year-old Major Holmes, who is he's the image of her actually in every way. Yeah. But she was a neurosurgeon, and she was a human being and a lovely person. Yeah.
Has your connection with Cuba crossed over to the field of sport? And do you think, they're very dynamic and they're very athletic. How do you think they would play football, for example?
Well, they'd probably beat us after a year's practice, but we're not going to let them do that. We have a vested interest in it. No, Davis, he used to go to school there every winter. He had a very nice upbringing. He'd spend January, February, March, and the schools in Ireland were very good. They let him do it because he learned Spanish and he learned other things. So he had, there's a lot of guys on the street in Cuba, and everyone's the same. So the doctor's son and the working man's son are friends, and there's nothing extraordinary about that. But he had a little friend called Alejandro, who was a young boy who lived in the house next door, who had been given the house. They moved from Santiago after some kind of hurricane. The whole family moved in. So there was about 3 families living in this mansion. This youngster, the last time he was with us, the last time we were in together in Tarara, they were having a mini Olympics, and I was kind of a little bit involved in. But this youngster, he was 16 at the time, 17, but he ran 60 meters in 11 and a half seconds in slip-flops.
Yeah.
That is, now he's in the sports field, so he may well be an Olympian. But what really amazed me about Cuban sport is you go through the park at lunchtime, and you see boys and girls sitting under a banana tree or something, not on their mobile phones, playing chess. Unbelievable. On the back page of Rama is sports, and you have baseball, boxing, and chess. Chess is a big national sport. So intellectually, and people playing dominoes, people playing checkers as well, they are sports mad, they're music mad, they're dance mad.
And they get, and they get all the opportunities, they get to do all the sports.
They do?
Yes, yeah.
Well, in Latino American Stadium, Deportivo is Derecho Humano. Sport is a human right. Yeah. It's not just for the wealthy and the well-off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's endorsed in the Constitution.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah. But they understood how important sport is, and particularly team sports. to build a sense of community and a sense of teamwork and a sense of responsibility for the richer persons on the team.
Yeah. So they've democratized sport in a way that is quite unprecedented. Yeah.
It's a shame to see a number of the better athletes now jumping ship and moving to, and, you know, dying, unfortunately, from things like cocaine overdoses and stuff, you know? Yeah. There's a youngster there, a big shot from the Marlins, from one of the big teams that died there a couple of years back from drug mishap, multi-millionaire.
I think we were just going to wrap up by asking if there's anything that you wanted to add.
I'm sorry we haven't been able to do more for Cuba. I mean, in fact, we have sat and watched them being abused for 60 years and done nothing about it. What's happened in that country is one of the great atrocities of modern times is a horrible stain on the Western world. But then Susan Sontag did say that the white race is the cancer of human history. And that's a pretty accurate statement. I do believe, though, that the future of the world will emanate from places like Cuba, Palestine, and Eritrea, through liberation-loving people.
David Hickey, it's been fascinating and a real privilege to talk to you. So
well,
thank
Helen,
you very
I
much.
know your hard work that you have done and your wonderful writing and your wonderful work as well, Nina. And I think it is important that we persist, that it doesn't become normalized, that we keep telling people this is pathology. And what you do with pathology is you kill it off, you cut it out, and you stomp it to death. And that is what has to be done to this thing.